Great. Welcome everybody to Climate Group's last workshop and webinar of the year. We will be discussing towards decarbonizing heavy industry sectors in India, and we have perspectives from businesses, from civil society, and from a couple of eminent addresses as well. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Divya Sharma, who is the Executive Director at Climate Group India, to please share welcome remarks.
Thank you, Pujarini. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thanks very much. So good evening, everyone. Greetings to all on behalf of Climate Group, and welcome to the workshop on decarbonizing heavy industry sectors in India, perspectives from businesses and civil society. This is second in line with the deliberations we have been having under our work on heavy industries decarbonization, supported by the Swedish government. As one of the fastest growing economies in the world, India is poised for continued socio-economic development and also committed to adopt development pathways that are sustainable. Heavy industries sector is an important part of our sustainable growth story, with a huge potential to decarbonize their operations and production. We are aware that both from a policy perspective and industry perspective, there seems to be a gap with regards to who is going to lead this transition towards decarbonization. And recognizing this, the Climate Group is working to drive purposeful mitigation actions in the heavy industry in India through our global campaigns and targeted projects. Climate Group is engaged with this work not only in India, but globally, and hence we are also looking at cross-learning between various initiatives and projects. I am delighted to welcome Mr. Suresh Prabhu, Member of Parliament, India, Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General TERI, who are here with us and have kindly agreed to enlighten us with their views on this very topical subject. I also welcome our distinguished panelists from civil society and industry, and are very keen to hear from them on their experience on the sector. Some of the work that has been already carried out by TERI, WBCSD, GIZ, and others have been duly accounted for in our study, and we realize the importance of the learning that emerges from that work. A lot of work is being carried out internationally, and we are pleased to have representation from Stockholm Environment Institute and International Energy Agency in this forum to bring international perspectives. So welcome to them as well. I also would like to take this opportunity to welcome WBCSD on this forum, and along with them representation on panel by ACC Limited and Godrej Industries. Just a piece of information that unfortunately our partners from CDP could not join us today because of some health reasons. So we will miss them for this workshop. Last but not the least, I welcome all our audiences and hope you are looking forward to hearing our experts. So without any ado, I would hand over to Pujarini to take this forward. Welcome again, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so very much, Divya. We will now move on to our keynote address, which will be shared by Shri Suresh Prabhu. Mr. Suresh Prabhakar Prabhu is currently a member of the Rajya Sabha, that is the upper house of the Parliament of Government of India. He is also India's Sherpa to the G7 and the G20. He has formerly been the Minister of Railways, the Minister of Commerce and Industry and Civil Aviation in Prime Minister Modi's first government. Mr. Prabhu has been instrumental in introducing and spearheading ambitious plans and regulations, including the National Environment Action Plan for abatement of pollution in the country, an action plan for achieving 33% forest cover in the country, and many more. Mr. Prabhu shaped the face of the Indian Railways by introducing several forward-looking initiatives, and we are very happy to have him here today and to hear from him. Over to you, Mr. Prabhu.
So thank you very much, and I really congratulate this great organization, the Climate Group, for organizing this very important event. Climate Group is one of the early organizations who realized the importance of climate change and also understood the significance of bringing together the global stakeholders together. So, though Climate Group was founded in London, and I remember the founder's vision, which again at that time was blazed by the Prime Minister Tony Blair, who worked on a very significant initiatives, brought together some of the top class policy makers, opinion makers, actors. Actors, I'm not saying the film actor, those who really act on this stage of climate change. And they actually created the most important necessary element of success in climate change, coalition building. And therefore, I'm very happy that Climate Group, such a great distinguished organization, is organizing this event on a very important, equally important subject of decarbonizing the heavy industry. Carbon is a villain of the piece. Carbon is a root cause of many problems associated with climate change. Reduction of emission load is necessary to deal with the adverse impact of climate change, but also to bring down the carbon will really result into making sure that we succeed in reducing and if not reducing, at least limiting the temperature rise to not more than 2 degrees centigrade from where the pre-industrial level it was. And that is what was agreed in Paris Accord. If you ask me, I am really not happy with 2 degrees allowing to rise to that level. Maybe 1.5 would be better. But of course, I always say that I hope the wishes were the horses. Then it could have been riding at a much faster rate. But even if to bring down 2 degrees, limiting it to 2 degrees itself is a great achievement, considering the way we are going. If we continue the way we are going, probably it would go to I don't know what level and what would be the disastrous consequences. Probably the scientists also don't want to think about it because then there is no need to think because nobody will be there. So why should we think about if it goes beyond a particular level? Then there is nothing to be thought about because everything would be gone. And therefore, limiting it to that level means countries will have to agree on limiting and reducing the carbon load. If countries have to agree, can country agree only in air? Each of the sector which contributes to that load has to limit it. And therefore, every segment of it which contributes to emission to carbon in the atmosphere has to reduce it. And finally, bring it down to zero, maybe make it positive if possible. And to do that, obviously, each sector has to do it and industry will have to do it. Industry is a main contributor to it in many ways. And therefore, heavy industry has a heavier load on their shoulders. The responsibility is far more heavier than others to reduce this carbon footprint. I remember when I was a Minister of Power under Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and we got a law passed in the Parliament called Energy Efficiency Law. That law created, and I signed it, administratively created a Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Mr. Dr. Ajay Mathur will speak after me, actually also held that position. But the first person who held that position when I appointed him was Mr. Shashi Shekhar. And we started working on various aspects of it. And one of them was reducing the carbon footprint of all the industries. Heavy industries of different kinds. By their very definition, they're heavy. their probably contribution is also heavier to carbon. So if you can bring down that through legislation, makes a lot of sense. So the Bureau of Energy Efficiency set the standards for each of these industries. And actually speaking, it makes business sense for the industry to reduce their emissions. Because if they use less energy, which in turn can result into emission, it makes business sense for them to do that. Energy is on the expense side of the profit and loss account. I'm a chartered accountant, so my chartered accountant mind is saying this. If you reduce the cost, it obviously will benefit in improving your bottom line. And therefore, it makes a lot of sense for them to reduce it at business level. But also, all corporate entities must now realize their responsibility to be a good corporate citizen. They must reduce the load because they are actually, by doing that, they are actually harming somebody else. Increasing carbon load far away from India, for example, harms India. The Himalayas are actually, the glaciers are melting. Maybe the Mount Everest height has been now redesignated, realigned, but general, we can see not here but all over the world, the glaciers are now coming and making way to and living their existence, becoming part of the river, and that is also going to, rivers are finally going to meet the ocean. So sea level rising is a reality. All of this happens somewhere because of each of the emissions that happen. So heavy industry will have to also decarbonize. That's the motto in Paris, not just for one industry, but for the whole planet. Those who are signatories to this. I welcome Secretary John Kerry's new appointment as a special envoy to the president, is right now the president-elect, to ensure that United States will play a leadership role. It's a very welcome development. We cannot deny climate change because we can deny anything. I can even deny that I am sick. It's possible. The most serious patient can deny that he's sick. But what happens eventually? If you deny the reality, you don't remain on the planet. But individual can have that choice of ignoring his own health and playing with his own life. But what about the planet? I don't have the responsibility to ruin others' lives. And therefore, I welcome this new appointment. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, our Honorable Prime Minister of India, has been playing a leadership role. In fact, as we speak, he has inaugurated the world's largest renewable energy park in the state of Gujarat, in the desert of Gujarat. For wind and solar both, more than 20,000 megawatts will be generated. And in any case, that is on line with India's commitment to make 100,000 megawatts of solar and 75,000 megawatts of wind. And I'm very happy that Climate Group is bringing together all of them on one platform. In fact, I'm very happy to say that I was also associated with Climate Group in the early years. Today, the challenges are far more when the Climate Group was set. But I think again, the sanity is coming back into the world thinking. We're also realizing that we cannot just ignore the reality. We cannot say the sun. I can see the sun rising, but I can say, no, sun has not risen. I can say that. Nobody can deny you the right of being insane. But by doing that, you're harming not only your own self, but others, your own countries, your own countrymen, but the rest of the world. And therefore, each sector has to contribute, heavy industry has to contribute. Heavy industry will benefit from doing that. And in India, we are definitely committed to work towards this objective. Dr. Mathur will tell you about how the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, which I had a good fortune of setting it up, legislatively as well as administratively, will now play a key role in ensuring as a regulator, facilitator, enabler to make this happen. They always have an ongoing dialogue with the industry. And I'm very happy to see that industry itself has responded extremely well to these new challenges. Let me congratulate you. I can see on the screen, so the most distinguished world leaders who are participating in this program from different parts of the world. And therefore, I am very sure, including my favorite place, Stockholm, where I used to be there on the Global Water Partnership headquarters. I used to go there so often, but also I've been there many times for many different reasons. And therefore, I am very happy that Sweden will play also a key role in bringing together. I congratulate Divya Sharma, who is playing a very important leadership role into these activities. I also congratulate Pujarini Sen for doing this. For those who don't understand Hindi very well, she's the she's the one who is the high priest as a Pujarini. So she will be the one who I'm sure the gods will always respond to her prayers, because priest, we need always a high priest woo the god to help us to address the climate change problem. So I'm sure the Pujarini will also help us to achieve our target. I'm very happy that my friends from industry, including Godrej and others, are here. And I can tell you, Godrej is one of the most enlightened group in the country. Mr. Jamshed Godrej, my dear friend, who has worked with me on many platforms in climate change, and we still work. I think we'll all work together. So let me stop here, because I can see so many distinguished friends of mine who are going to speak about it. Mr. Hemant Malya, I'm sure, will also talk about it along with Atul Prakash. And of course, we have Madam Mete, who will be speaking about it. I don't want to pronounce the first name because I'm sure I will mispronounce it. So I will not say, but I congratulate you for being here on this program. Mr. Rao is also there. So all the best. Mr. Kundan Manwal is also there, and thank you very much. And Dr. Ajay Mathur will give a very good perspective about what India is doing. But let me assure you one thing, my last comment. I am available to you to support any good initiative related to reducing our emissions globally. I worked on 16 global organizations related to energy, environment, climate change. I also founded India's one of the great think tanks called Council for Energy, Environment and Water, CEW. I'm the founding chairman. So we'll work together. I was also the co-founder with Jamshed Godrej on Shakti Foundation. So we'll all work together and take this message forward. Thank you very much. Congratulations to all of you. God bless you all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Pujarini, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prabhu. I will now invite Dr. Ajay Mathur, who is the Director General of TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute in India. Dr. Mathur is not just the Director General of TERI, he's also a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change. He was the DG of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency that Mr. Prabhu was speaking about in the Government of India between 2006 and 2016, and introduced several path-breaking initiatives and programs to drive energy efficiency in industries, buildings, and appliances. He has been a key Indian climate change negotiator, and he was the Indian spokesperson at the 2015 climate negotiations at Paris as well. He is a global leader on technological approaches to address climate change. Recently, he has joined a global group of industrial, financial, and think tank leaders as the co-chair called Energy Transition Commission, which
Yeah, I know.
sorry,
And you saw enough people from all walks of life, they come to me. I just strongly follow thousands of them. Thousands.
Go
all
on,
right,
Pujarini.
all right, sorry, all right. As the co-chair of the Energy Transitions Commission, which will suggest ways for companies and countries to move towards climate-friendly energy futures. So over to you, Dr. Mathur.
Thank you very much, Pujarani. Thank you, Divya, for inviting me. And it's wonderful to be amongst friends of many, many years. Today, as Mr. Prabhu mentioned, we are at the cusp of enabling decarbonization of our electricity sector. Thanks to the very ambitious goals on renewable energy that the country has set. Today, solar electricity is the cheapest electricity in India when the sun is shining. And day after tomorrow, in 2 years' time, according to the SECI tenders, we should have round-the-clock electricity based on solar plus batteries, which would be competitive with coal. And one can therefore plausibly believe that beyond that, all new addition that occurs in the electricity sector, all new capacity addition would be based on renewable energy and storage. This is a big deal. Mr. Prabhu also talked of his leadership and how he made the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, which I've also had the pleasure of being associated with. And with the actions of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency in enabling the lowering of the scale of demand, the rate at which demand for energy increases on the one hand, and number two, now with more and more of the electrical demand being met by renewables, we are now at the stage where the next step is we need to electrify all areas possible where fossil fuels are used, and obviously transport is the first. So in many, many areas of transport, we are finding that electric-based transport is cost effective, at least over the lifetime of the vehicle. So whether it is buses, whether it is two-wheelers, we see it happening. It's a matter of replication that we need to focus on, including the availability of charging stations as we go ahead. Unfortunately, this is not the case in the heavy industry sector. In the heavy industry sector, we still need to make economic breakthroughs in many applications and technological breakthroughs in at least one or two applications. I would like to spend the next few minutes focusing on how do we move ahead. The analysis that TERI and the Energy Transitions Commission has focused on has very clearly demonstrated that going ahead today, as I said, renewable electricity is cheaper when the sun is shining, and in probably 2 years, renewable electricity is cheaper round the clock. We also see that by 2030, not that far away, by 2030, green hydrogen, that means hydrogen made from water, which into hydrogen and oxygen using renewable electricity, would be at prices that are comparable to the hydrogen that we get today from the reformation of methane, steam reformation of methane, which it costs about $2 per kg. And we are looking at a future in which 2030, in which we have green hydrogen at similar prices. The short point is, therefore, that in 10 years' time, renewables and hydrogen would provide economically viable competition and zero carbon competition to fossil fuels. So let us spend a few moments and see how we are moving ahead. And the first sector that I would like to focus on in the heavy industry sector is this iron and steel sector. India is the second largest producer of iron and steel in the world. And our assessment shows that from the current steel capacity of something of the order of 142 million tons per annum, we would go to 245 million tons per annum by 2030, and more than 500, 525, 528, something of that sort, million tons per annum by 2050. These are large numbers. And in a sense, we are alone, because as far as countries of the world, including China, are concerned, the developed countries in China, they've already built up all the steel capacity they want. The countries which still need more steel will be building their capacity in about 10 years' time. And by 10 years' time, you would have a zero carbon technology available, which is economically competitive. But today, we are looking at a carbon future which is constrained, but we are looking at no possible economically viable technology, carbon-free technology for steel. This creates a problem. The steel manufacturers come and ask us, so what should we do? How do we know that the investments that we make now you, metaphorically you, I can mean the government more than me, what if there is in the 2040s, there is a requirement that our carbon emission should not be more than so much, and we are stuck with coke-based steelmaking. This is a real issue. And I think the current mix, the steel industry is a very good example of how industry is across the sector. It's a mix of old and new technologies, exhibiting poor to excellent, best in the world techno-economic performances that we see. Consequently, the slow pace of modernization, renovation, expansion of the older plants needs to be accelerated. So this year, we started looking at it. And early this year, the Honorable Minister of Steel released a report in which we looked at the issue of towards a low carbon steel sector. And very clearly, the kinds of examples in the world on zero carbon steel came out, the best being what is being done in Sweden, where at a demonstration level, they're looking at the creation of steel using hydrogen for reduction instead of coke for reduction. And therefore, you don't have CO2 coming up. But as I said, this is a demonstration problem. But the good thing is that, and we arranged for a webinar of this company in Sweden, hybrid technology, and all the steel makers of India and the steel policy makers of India. And one of the things that came out was they have preponed the demonstration plant rollout from 2030 to 2025. In other words, they are so confident of the ability to use hydrogen that they can do it now. This merges extremely well with our hydrogen analysis. Because, the problem for all these years has been, here is hydrogen, if you go for green hydrogen, hydrogen made from electrolysis of water using renewable energy, today, at today's prices, it will cost you about $5 per kg. And if you're looking at hydrogen from methane reformation, you're looking at $2 per kg. Huge difference. But now if you start getting things into the market, like the steel industry, where it will be cost effective at $3. You look at transport, which would be effective at approximately $4. Now you've got a cascade. If we can bring down the price of hydrogen from $5 to $4 through the first thing, economies of scale, particularly in electrolyzers, and that's the first point that I'd like to leave you with. We need to invest in electrolyzer technology, and particularly in the technological performance, and most importantly, lowering the cost of electrolyzers. That is, simply put, that is the largest contributor to the relative competitiveness of hydrogen. If we can do that, we can bring down the cost to where it starts making sense in a lot of sectors. And then you start increasing its volume, prices fall further. And then we go into the steel sector and so on and on. In other words, now we have a roadmap on how to move ahead on hydrogen. This roadmap was released yesterday when we brought out this report. I don't know whether you can see it or not. It's called The Potential Role of Hydrogen in India. It's available on our website. And this particular roadmap of how it becomes competitive is part of the techno-economic analysis that has been presented here. Now, the second point, the second sector that I would like to look at is this. This is a sector where, unfortunately, unlike the steel sector, we still do not have a zero carbon technology. But it is quite possible that the amount of CO2 produced per ton of clinker produced, or per ton of cement produced, or even per ton of concrete produced keeps on decreasing. We can have better demand management via material circularity. So once old buildings are destroyed, you use that material to convert the clinker into building materials. the development of lower carbon heat technologies, particularly the electrification of heat instead of using coal, and new construction materials. Together, these have the potential to reduce the CO2 emissions. But we still do not know how we can go to zero, and therefore this is an area where carbon capture, utilization, and storage still has a potential. I would like to point out that 10 years ago, we thought that the electricity sector is impossible to go zero carbon without CCUS. 5 years ago, we thought that the steel sector is impossible to go zero carbon without CCUS. Today, the cement sector clearly is there. I'm hoping that in the years to come, we will develop technologies which keep on reducing the amount of CO2 we produce from the cement sector. I'd like to end by focusing on the key issue of how do we make this change happen. Now, this is an area where we need discussion, and the climate groups bringing together of various stakeholders provides a great opportunity to do so. Shri Prabhu, talking earlier, had talked about the Bureau of Energy Efficiencies programs. One of the major programs which addresses heavy industries, the Perform, Achieve, and Trade program, which gives specific mandates to companies to reduce the amount of energy that they use per ton of product that they produce. I wonder whether, and if they're able to do more than their target, they get the excess savings in forms of energy saving certificates, which can be traded. And I wonder whether it is time now, and I leave this for your consideration, I wonder whether it is time now that people can ask, instead of an energy saving certificate, give us a carbon emission reduction certificate. That, I think, would provide the kind, both the recognition, but more importantly, the economic incentive that is needed for us to move ahead. It would enable the creation of coalitions that can help in the development of risky technologies where the commercial case is not yet proven, much more in cement, but also in steel. And we hope that together with the commercialization of renewable electricity and hydrogen, we will be able to move even in the heavy industry sector to a future which is zero carbon. I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mathur, not just for your very important points, but also ending by sharing potential solutions, which is what I hope our panelists will now share with us. So moving on to the panel discussion, and I want to go first to Dr. Gyokse, because I did see her smiling as you were talking as well. And our first question is something that that you've already sort of mentioned in your address. So Gyokse, I want to talk to you to start off the conversation to talk about the hybrid project. It has been an outstanding example in addressing decarbonization, as Dr. Mathur pointed out. And I want to understand what you see as learnings from India from such a multi-stakeholder collaboration. We know that 3 Swedish companies have been part of this, and we want to understand that this initiative is an important initiative because steel as a material for development of modern society has a big impact in today's production lines. So we do want to hear from you. Before we do that, I just want to introduce Dr. Gyokse. She is currently the evidence lead at a leadership group for industry transition secretariat, which we all know as LEAD IT, which is hosted by the Stockholm Environment Institute. She is a research professional with a decade of regulatory analysis, project development, and stakeholder management, and experience focused on energy and industry transitions. She is also the honorary head of research and academic engagement for the Women in Energy, Climate, and Sustainability Foundation, and a founding member of the Women in Green Hydrogen. We're very happy to have you here with us, and looking forward to your comments.
Thanks a lot, and I hope you can all hear me. And thanks for the invitation. I will, in response to your request, of course, I'll start with saying a few things about hybrid project, but within Lead It, it's not a technical group as such, so it's a political and private partnership. Hence, what I can say from Lead It, from other areas of work that SCI carries out with Lead It, is that it had been a trust-building exercise. So the project is a success because of the commitments of industries, but that is facilitated through the targets and commitments also made by the Swedish government. So there had been a great trust building, let's say, process between private and public sector in Sweden that I believe has enabled this project to be a successful initiative. And that's what we do within the Lead It Secretariat. So Lead It brings together 13 countries and 16 companies around the world that are committed to reaching net zero emissions from the industry by 2050. And it was launched by the governments of Sweden and India at the UN Climate Action Summit last September in 2019. And this initiative is supported by the World Economic Forum. So it supports public-private collaboration for sectoral and cross-sectoral learning experience when it comes to innovation opportunities such as Lead It and also for new technologies. And Lead It enables this collaboration between political and industry decision makers by convening high-level dialogues to catalyze leadership. So one such example is our summit, the Lead It Summit, which the first one took place this month. The participants were all Lead It members. We hosted it in Sweden, although virtually. So the next one, if the conditions allow, will take place in India. And during the summit, the participants were all Lead It members, pledged to create a stable and reliable market for green industrial products, specifically by exploring, and before COP26, the pathways and partnerships to promote sustainable green procurement. And the summit also identified charging infrastructure to support electrification of heavy good transport and coherent policy on carbon capture as important areas for joint action. So additionally, the Lead It Secretariat carries out analysis to improve the collective understanding of the opportunities and challenges in industry transitions. So last month, we have launched the Industry Transition Tracker, which is an online database of industry transition roadmaps that allows users to contrast different trends in the decarbonization plans of different countries and sectors. And we define these roadmaps broadly as long-term decarbonization pathways, visions, or strategic plans that include decarbonization targets. So I actually invite you all to explore this interactive tool at industrytransition.org. Lead It also provides actionable measures on innovation and finance and gives a platform for sharing know-how. For instance, we did a scoping study this year on creating a market for green industrial products and identified that there are 3 policy measures that are receiving a lot of attention. These policy measures are green public procurement, carbon contracts for difference, and carbon border adjustment. Of these measures, the most direct way for governments to catalyze demand for green industrial products is by being the source of demand through green public procurement. We note that none of these measures alone is a silver bullet, and international collective action may be necessary to build momentum within global industry value chains. And collective action on these measures, such as through public and private buyer alliances and clubs and others, can send stronger demand signals, but they do require considerable work to establish common standards. Also, having buyers willing to pay a premium price for green industrial products is not the only piece of the puzzle. So policies to catalyze demand need to go hand in hand with efforts to create an enabling environment that supports the business case for industry transition. And these three measures are yet to be tested in the context of industry transition. So we therefore encourage knowledge exchange on design of policy measures, establishment of alliances, and joint commitment around green public procurement and development of benchmarks for green industrial products. And most discussions around these policy options are admittedly in developed countries. Therefore, in another brief, we explored particular issues faced by developing countries in the industry transition. We focused on Indonesia, Mexico, and South Africa, as they are all top producers in heavy industry among developing countries, and all have decarbonization measures for industry in place. But of course, they vary in effectiveness. And our analysis revealed 5 key barriers to industry transition that is common to all these 3 countries. And these are technology, finance, knowledge and capacity, socioeconomic context and jobs, and politics, power, and vested interests. Finally, I'd like to mention that LEADED supports governments and industries to co-produce stakeholder-led pathways to low-carbon industry transformation. So we are currently developing a step-by-step guide for designing a complex road mapping process. This road mapping process is actually also what has facilitated hybrid project success in Sweden, as the Swedish government actually worked actively on creating roadmaps for each sector and decarbonization of these sectors, which gave clarity to investors and private sector. And in 2021, we will be exploring opportunities to support developing countries in their road mapping exercise in cooperation with local partners. And we do hope to also carry out one such exercise in India. We're also working to expand the transition tracker to cover more countries. So by early 2021, we expected to cover industry transition roadmaps in all G20 countries. And thanks for listening. And I do look forward to receiving any questions you may have and also hear from the rest of the panel today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gyokse, for your time. And on that note, if you have questions for the speakers, please feel free to keep putting them in the chat box. We do have time at the end, and we will take the questions that you have at that time. I want to sort of take it by turn. So we've heard from Gyokse, and then we have several members of civil society on the panel as well. But first, I'd like to go to Mr. Rao, Mr. KN Rao, because let's get a perspective from the businesses first. I want to understand from your perspective, Mr. Rao, will a dedicated government policy or strategy or roadmap specifically for industry decarbonization help accelerate transition in India? If yes, what should be the contours and principles of such a policy? And on the same question, after Mr. Rao, we'd also like to hear from Hemant Malia of CEW. I'll introduce him then. Just to give you an introduction to Mr. Rao, he is the former director of ACC Cement. He was with ACC Cement for many, many years, and currently at Zinteo. Mr. Rao has over 38 plus years, so close to 4 decades of experience heading air pollution control business. As the Director, Energy, Environment and Sustainability at ACC Limited, he headed the energy efficiency, renewable energy, environment and sustainability functions at ACC. Mr. Rao is currently a Senior Advisor of Decarbonization of Cement, Steel and Built Environment projects with Zinteo India. He has actively contributed in developing the National Plan on Climate Change and New Emission Standards for cement and power sector, major technical contribution to MOFCC and CPCB in developing online emissions reporting protocol. He has also provided key contribution in developing low carbon roadmap for the Indian cement sector specifically, and he represented the Indian cement industry and the power ministry at global forums like COP21 in Paris. So over to you, Mr. Rao, on what the contours of government policy could look like.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I first of all congratulations to all the esteemed panelists. And before I speak about the policy, that I think the government of India has done a fantastic work in the last 6 years in terms of coming out with the clear action plan in terms of the renewable energy. I think there is a commitment on solar and going for 170 gigawatts and making another announcement by 2030 going towards 450 gigawatts. We could see the action which is taking place on the green energy, which is ultimately has come to the market price levels. Now that is going very rapidly. Now the next challenge comes to the built environment in India, with the steel, cement, aluminum, and glass. All other things goes into the building, and also the operation phase of the building also has a huge amount of carbon footprint. 40% of the carbon footprint is coming from the built environment. Similarly, the steel sector is contributing 10% of the GHG emissions. Cement production producing 10% of GHG emissions. Similarly, aluminum and other sectors. What I felt is that the government has already come out in terms of the job has started in the National Action Plan for Climate Change, and their missions have been identified, and progress happened on the PAT, the energy intensity reduction from the energy intensive sectors, and also clean energy cess was introduced, and RPO compliance requirement of mandatory you have to use so much amount of percentage of green energy. These were a grand success, and also, but the challenge right now is what are the ways, like each sector has actually developed its own roadmap. Like cement is the first sector in India is developed a low carbon roadmap aligning to 2 degrees scenario for Indian steel in the cement industry. Privately, all the companies put together and developed the roadmap. This is the first time one sector developing a roadmap for a 2-degree scenario, and this was well appreciated globally. And now that is only up to coming to 350 kgs of CO2 per ton of cement. Now we need to go to the now that is about 2-degree scenario, but now we need to go towards zero. So what are the things which are required to be moving from 350 to zero? That's currently the challenge. And what are the policy interventions will actually make the acceleration of this 350 to zero? Now that is something which required. I think definitely the previous speaker who has come out very clearly, the barriers, the technology and policy barriers and the finance barriers, and also about the creating the awareness. All these are the basic issues. Like cement has identified few challenges. We can come down to 350. I think the technologies have been identified. Now it's a matter of a few years it got penetrated. Now how to go from 350 to zero? So that's something is the area where we need to work, and where definitely policy interventions are required in terms of the demonstration technologies which required to be supported in terms of the policy. In terms of gap funding for the first few years of the demonstration projects, and also able to arrange the technology access and also the finance access to these projects. In the process, they become at least viable with a small gap fund from the government. And the moment its scaling happens, most probably the prices will come to the level where most of the companies can actually implement. So this is same thing what happened on the renewable energy and solar, and you have a tariff regime of the preferential tariff regime for 5 years, and later now it has become a market pricing. So the same thing will happen on any technology. Like I think Mr. Suresh Prabhu was mentioning about green hydrogen. So, and are we talking about a CCU, which we were talking about 4 years back, $100 per ton. Now we are talking about $30 per ton. So there is a chance that we are able to bring down the price of green hydrogen. We are able to bring down the cost of the decarbonization cost from 30 to how lower we can actually bring. And one more important aspect to the government in terms of the policy intervention is that, first of all, make a green label mandatory. Make the companies, every company, to report their carbon footprint on the product, and which ultimately should, this is the one first is to bring awareness, and also people between the companies, they will try to compete that my product is actually lower carbon footprint. Let the customer aware of the carbon. So right now there is no green standards in the country. There is no definition of what is green. And for all the industrial heavy industry products, which we require a green labeling in terms of the product footprint need to be reported. And that should be the first aspect. And second thing is another financial barrier is that how to differentiate a green versus conventional. Like a product which is having a net zero cement, can we have the same GST or a 28% duty like a conventional cement, which is one is a 1 ton per CO2 per ton of cement, another is 0 CO2 per ton of cement. Can we have in the same basket? So there should be financial reforms in terms of enabling tax policies which enables the people to move towards the green. One is that to create awareness and try to shift the demand towards the net zero products and how to position it. And this particular differentiation makes the company to do a transition from a high carbon products to a low carbon products. This is most important aspect of it. Now, the green buildings, another area where we are talking about buildings, which is ultimately steel, cement, aluminum, everything is going into it, where right now only 5% of the built area is only green. Now we want to do a transformation of 100%, which requires definitely a certain amount of product standards. The environment product declaration, green label for all the materials which goes into the building need to be brought in. So the government procurement, large part of the built environment is built by the government, whether the dams, highways, infrastructure, buildings, everything is government is there. And now whether the government actually comes out with the green procurement policy, where they actually introduce the of the elements which ultimately make the government to actually go with the green material procurement. In the process that there is a minimum demand for the green material in the country, which ultimately make the companies to invest money into the low carbon transition and go for invest under the technologies. Most probably we'll be able to see a rapid transformation. One is the government and the voluntary actions which are taking place on the private, that it is happening, but that is very small. Without the government intervention on the renewable energy, this might not happen. Similar thing which is required on the policy intervention related to the in terms of the government procurement and also the standards and mandatory labeling. These are all very, very essential. And the gap fund is required for the demonstration project. Like we are talking about cement going from 350 to 0. We wanted to use CCU, carbon capture and use. Now there are multiple technologies using nanofiltration, or we want to go for scrubbing, and then how to get the pure gas, pure form of CO2, which we can convert into product. Now how we actually encourage these startups or other companies who are actually attempting it, how we can do participation and the government role in that, how we can actually encourage. Most important is that how to create a domestic carbon trading mechanism. We have a PAT system, which is ESETs, but that ESET is about energy efficiency improvement over 3 or 4 years. That is a good scheme, but that doesn't give the acceleration, the speed what we wanted. We wanted a domestic carbon market trading mechanism where we will not have a patent RPO and REC mechanism. We will have a carbon certificates, and the companies will get the reduction targets, and in the process that they will overachieve those certificates, ultimately can trade this certificate between the governments like European Union and India or Canada or Australia or Japan. Can actually, we have offsets the industry has created. These can be traded, means a domestic market trading mechanism of carbon to be integrated with the global trading. Most probably we'll be able to see a large amount of investment coming into the decarbonization technology by the industry, because any technology, if you're able to do, there is opportunity for scaling, because large capacity to be added in India. In the process that we'll be able to put a scale of plants much far larger than the all other countries, because that is already matured market where there is no potential available to add any additional capacity. So that's the one of the area that India can create a huge amount of offsets for the many developed countries, apart from they reducing their own demand. I see that like India need to have an aspiration that by 2050 we're going to be at 1.5 degree, at 2040 at 2 degree, and at 2060 we are carbon neutral. As a country, when we think about it, and then each sector actually drives their own agenda, and ultimately the government should collaborate with each industrial sector and to make them to develop a roadmap towards these objectives of 2 degree and 1.5 degree and net zero. And this is something which required to be done in a collaborative way. And in the process of the roadmap, it comes with a lot of barriers, and these need to be addressed. I think at least in the next 2 years, we should work on, like right now the TERI has developed along with the ETC has developed the steel roadmap. Cement industry along with the IAA and European Cement Research Association, we made the low carbon cement roadmap. Right now, the Global Cement Association talking about net zero concrete. Like that in aluminum, every sector we should ultimately develop a roadmap, find out the barriers, and we should ultimately discuss and see that how to remove these barriers, and so that this journey towards 2030 is accelerated. And we should be able to see that market mechanisms are created for funding this development projects. This is one of the idea, and many technologies still not being penetrated. I give an example that offshore wind. India has a long boundary of sea, but offshore wind is not penetrated. Still, whatever we have is on the onshore. And also the green hydrogen is a huge potential both for steel and for cement and for many other. CCU is requirement for most of the process industries, that what we need to actually do it. And most probably there could be multi-sector coalition to implement a CCU project or a CCS project, whether the power sector or cement sector or a steel sector. So there is a chance for every industry to get into that particular initiative, including the government, and with the technology separate, we should be able to demonstrate.
Definitely.
I
Thank
hope
you.
I've actually exceeded my time.
No, that's fine. Thank you so much. And I'm going to politely, if you see me doing this for future reference, that's me trying to indicate that we're running out of time. But thank you so much, Mr. Rao. And it's really good hearing from industry. And you've actually already pointed us towards a couple of solutions that might help industry. And even if it's the green labeling or the other points that you mentioned. So I want to go now to look at the same question from the civil society perspective. So Hemant, if I can call on you to share with us what you think could be, changes in government policy, strategy, roadmaps that could specifically help industry decarbonization. I want to share for our listeners that Hemant leads the Industrial Sustainability and Competitiveness team at CEW, otherwise also known as the Council. His work focuses on industrial growth through sustainable means. He's also a member of the Council's air quality team. His experience spans energy markets, energy efficiency, environment, and climate change. And in the energy space, he has conducted market analysis, policy analysis, price forecasting, and modeling of energy systems. In the environment and climate change space, he has developed inventories, protocols, and regulations, and analyzed the potential for criteria, pollutant, and GHG mitigation and associated economics. So over to you, Hemant, to share your thoughts with us.
Can you hear me, Pujarini? Great, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me to talk today, and a good afternoon to everyone. So I guess I'll keep my comments fairly high level and generic in nature, because I think to a certain extent it would be presumptuous to kind of say what the solution should be before actually looking at some of the issues in detail. And I'll get to that in a bit. So I think you have a two-part question. First of all, I think it's important to understand why do we need policies or roadmaps, right? So when you look at in terms of the heavy industries, they have a very long investment cycle. Also, they have very large sizes of investment. For example, if you look at the steel industry, a blast furnace, costs in billions of dollars, right? And once the investment is made, it's going to stay there for 40, 50, 60 years. So therefore, policy needs to be designed such that, there is policy certainty for the industry. And for decarbonization, this is certainly very important, right? The second, aspect of, why a policy or roadmap is important is for, the stakeholders to recognize clearly what their roles are. It may be the industry itself, but also the entire ecosystem. So if you look at the electric mobility space, for example, because there is policy certainty to a certain extent, you have business and financial models being developed. You have, entities recognizing whether they need to play in the renting space, or how do you, set up battery charging and, swap, mechanisms. So all of that ecosystem gets built when the stakeholders are aware of what their roles are. And that's why a roadmap is very important. And the final point I want to make on the roadmap and why it's important is to provide the right market signals. So for example, if you look at heavy duty transport, right now the question is, are we looking at electric, hybrid, LNG, hydrogen, or methanol? And so if the policy is not very clear, then the market signals can go the right or the wrong way. And the challenge there is, if the market signals are mixed, or the policy is not very coherent, then you have a wait and watch policy from the industry end, which means time is lost, precious time in this case, and therefore action is not initiated, soon enough. So with that context on why a roadmap of policy is required, I'll segue into, the general contours and principles that I think, or we think as an institution are important, and kind of segueing into from my previous point. I think there needs to be coherence in terms of, policy. So for example, if you talk about steel decarbonization, right? Uh, then there are multiple ministries involved. There is the MNRE from the renewable energy perspective. There is the Ministry of Power, because you need to wheel power from, the point of RE generation to the point of end use for hydrogen generation. You have the steel ministry, etc. So unless there is coherence in the policy, you will find that, there will be a freeze in action at the industry end. So this is something that is, very critical. And kind of a side comment from that perspective, we believe that, since decarbonization deals with multiple aspects and multiple energy sources, be it fossil fuels or renewables, an energy steering committee or a council which is cross-cutting across government ministries is essential to, make decarbonization possible. Otherwise, you'll have different signals coming from different ministries. Um, so with that said, let me get into the general principles that we think are important, in policy formation. I think one of the critical aspects that is often overlooked is, where does India stand in terms of its industrial growth and aspirations. And that is important from the perspective of, not necessarily taking, templates from the more developed countries and trying to force fit it into the Indian context. And so that is very important in formulating any policy that we have for industrial decarbonization. Otherwise, we are setting it up for failure. And in that context, I think, the government's role is also important in terms of, what are our objectives beyond the short and medium term in terms of the Paris Climate Agreement. Because right now, we are, resting on our laurels saying that, we are going to overachieve our NDC targets. But is that, enough for the industry? And the answer is no, because the industry is looking at a longer, investment cycle. And so we, the government needs to look at what happens beyond the short and medium term in terms of the Paris Climate Agreement. In terms of the content of the policy or roadmap, I think it's important to set specific targets, and I think the RE example is very pertinent. Now that we have a very specific 175 gigawatts by 2022 and 450 by 2030, those targets give the right impetus for all the players to take action. We may or may not achieve those very specific targets, but at least there's an acceleration in terms of what activities are being undertaken. So any industrial decarbonization policy needs to have very specific targets. The second thing it needs to have is specific pathways and the kind of technological support that the government is willing to provide, because generally we see mission documents or policies which are good in terms of the objectives that the policy has, but that's not specific enough in terms of what pathway we choose. So for example, in cement, are we looking at carbon capture, or are we looking at utilizing biomass? And those are two different pathways and require different sets of measures from all the stakeholders involved, including the government. So the pathways have to be a part of the policy. Another aspect that is often found at least to be thin or lacking is how are we going to actually implement policy, right? It's one thing to say these are the objectives, but how are all the stakeholders going to come together and actually implement the policy? And which brings me to the next few points I want to make, which is the stakeholder engagement. And this does not just mean the industry, it means all industry, government, civil society, etc., that will propel this mission forward. They need to be involved fairly deeply, right in from the initiation of the policy making process. Right now that is happening, but it's not deep enough. And part of it is because civil society, and I guess I'm straying away from the subject a little bit, but I think it's important. I think the civil society can provide the right amount of analysis, background, the traps we might fall into, set the overall context before the policy is actually put in place, so that beyond the objectives, it's very clear what the stakeholders are expected to do. And the one final point I want to make, which we strongly believe needs to happen, is right now policies formulated using working groups, often with industry, etc. But then, after the policy document comes out, the working groups basically, are disbanded. We believe that, the policy formulation is the beginning of the process and not the end of the mission. And therefore, in the case of industrial decarbonization, if you want to make it a mission, these working groups need to be involved not just during the policy formulation phase, but throughout the implementation, so that the feedback, from the real world keeps going back, to the government, and the policy can then be tweaked, as necessary, because policy is a living document. It's not a static document. So with that, I'll take a pause. Those are my initial comments, and if people have questions, I'm happy to take them.
Great, thank you so much, Hemant, and for very correctly outlining the principles that government policy should be based on as we move towards heavy industry decarbonization. I want to now go back and hear from businesses again. So we have Mr. Atul Prakash with us today. Mr. Atul Prakash is currently the head of marketing and supply chain at Godrej Industries Limited India. He has over 25 years of experience in the area of specialty chemical industries in diverse areas such as operations, supply chain of new projects, and business development. Mr. Prakash is passionate about green technologies and energy conservation. And apart from heading marketing and supply chain for Godrej Industries chemical business, he also leads green initiatives for the group as well. So we know that so that there are two questions that we have for you, Mr. Prakash. The first is what is needed to drive faster and wider adoption of existing best available technologies, so leaving aside green hydrogen and CCUs, but including technologies around energy efficiency, material circularity, demand management. And the second question is around green hydrogen, but also research and development. So as we've heard both in the keynote speeches and the special address, and through the session so far, the fuel of the future is said to be green hydrogen, and India is one of the members of Mission Innovation working towards renewable and clean energy as well. We've been doing interviews and interactions with uh, both businesses and civil society, and I wonder if there is sometimes a perspective that there isn't enough focus from Indian industries on research and development, and that we do need to move towards more focus, both from industry and government, on prioritizing investment in R&D. And of course, R&D is also a driver for international funding to support multiple demonstration projects and to really support this transition. So the second question is, what role do you see for yourself to promote more aggressive research and development in transformational technologies such as green hydrogen and CCUs? So over to you, Mr. Prakash. You're perhaps on mute.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr.
Thank you.
Prakash.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me for such a wonderful topic discussion, and I'm enriched by listening to the views from our fellow panelists. Let me start with making a couple of statements that I come from chemical industry sector, and chemical industry is one of the large have a large carbon footprint. So this is one area where it is very important for the industry as a whole to look at how we are going to reduce our carbon footprint. And fortunately, industry has been working very progressively around this theme. And there are multiple energy efficiency measures which industry has taken in terms of innovative technologies, whether it's in terms of heating, cooling, which is a very primary requirement in chemical process industry. At the same time, India has done wonderful job in terms of solar power. Renewable energy today is available at a very cheap price, and sooner we will see with storage technologies improving steadily that 24/7 solar energy will be available at a very competitive pricing. In India, we are also in a very special position to drive this greener technologies, because we are the importers of the crude, LNG, everything back to India. Okay, so obviously this is a high cost energy source for the industry. So it's very interesting to look at not only energy efficiencies, which definitely are driving the low carbonization of the chemical industry, but looking at a greener hydrogen, which most of the speakers talked about. Interestingly, for chemical industry, hydrogen is not only as an energy source, but it is also a raw material, key raw material for certain building blocks, which are very important building blocks for chemical industry, such as ammonia, methanol. Okay, and a green hydrogen is definitely going to play a very big role to decarbonize the chemical sector. What we have seen, the developments which are driving the green hydrogen technologies and generation is primarily driven by chemical sector in the Western countries. Okay, with a lot of investment happening in the green hydrogen generation for the chemical industry. As rightly said, that it's still the green hydrogen cost is slightly high, not comparable to steam methane reforming by natural gas at the $2 level. But at the same time, there is a definite pull from the chemical industry to look for decarbonization, and hence green hydrogen is coming in a big way. So what we know is for sure the conventional hydrogen generation in our refineries, in our methanol plants or ammonia plants through this natural gas is a big emitter, which 10 to 12 tons of CO2 coming out of this with every ton of hydrogen generation. Okay, and on a second place, there's a technology which is quite a, I think I should say, electrolysis based hydrogen generation is a now very old technology. In India also, we have a commercial scale plant running way back in from 1960s, but unfortunately, as a country, we have not done enough to make electrolyzers within the country. Okay, and this is one of the clear focus area where the policies, government, the industry has to come together to look at how will we drive this cost of green hydrogen coming from electrolyzers, and the OPEX is already down in the form of solar energy cost. So what we have to really think of, how do we drive down this capex cost of electrolyzers to make it competitive very fast. And unless we start making world-class electrolyzers in India, it's not going to happen faster. So this is one area where I believe there's a lot of opportunity to look at technological interventions. Good technologies are available. India is a place where a lot of technical talent is available. We can bring back those technologies with right technology partners and drive down the cost rapidly. Another important raw material for chemical industry is CO2 itself. And again, lot is talked on this capturing technology. Okay, interestingly, for chemical industry, CO2 can be a feedstock for many things. Okay, and instead of taking CO2 from environment, we can look at from our polluting sources and try to build innovative products around that. One of the very interesting projects which I saw happened in southern part of India was where carbon capturing happened to make bicarbonate. Okay, and at a commercially successful scale. Okay, so these are the type of innovations which definitely Indian chemical industry will be looking at, and I see a huge R&D efforts required to drive such usage innovatively. Unfortunately, the R&D spend has been pretty low in our country. But with the focus coming on the climate change and the impact of climate, which is seen immediately, not for the future generations, I think is driving a lot of change which we see. One of the important things which is required is to have a right carbon pricing, which will definitely drive significant efforts and investments happening in the technologies which are already there, and then as it scales up, the cost will come down rapidly. As a user industry of energy as well as various chemicals, I see a role for the user industry to tie up along with technology providers to provide the testing facilities for the pilot plants, providing feedbacks on consistent basis, and also maybe using in-house the product coming out such as green hydrogen or CO2 to allow these technologies to get scaled and get cheaper in the due course of time. Okay. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you, Mr. Prakash. We will go now to our last couple of speakers. We have Kundan Barnwal from GIZ. Let me introduce him first. Kundan is currently working as advisor climate change at GIZ India in the environment, climate change, and natural resources management program, and is leading some of their work on carbon markets, climate change mitigation, including NAMA's nationally appropriate mitigation actions, and forestry. Kundan is a climate change mitigation policy and carbon market expert with more than 12 years of comprehensive experience on development, implementation, and evaluation of projects on climate change, carbon markets, climate finance, and MRV. He is also the speaker of climate change mitigation working group of, I want to say, TUVAS, Transport, Environment, Energy, and Water in Asia, a sector network that was established in Germany in 2002 as a platform for regional professional exchange and cooperation between GIZ experts in Asia and globally. He's also the author of several books on forestry, carbon markets, and air pollution abatement. So Kundan, I think in keeping with your experience, we want to hear from you on what is needed to strengthen collaboration both globally as well as within India to promote a more effective and accelerated transition to low carbon industry. Do we need more coalitions, global initiatives to support the industry decarbonization, or do we need to strengthen the existing ones, such as Mission Possible, the Lead It platform, Leadership Alliance, etc.?
Yeah, thanks, Pujarini. And first of all, let me thank the Climate Group for inviting me to this very, very interesting panel discussion. So I'll structure my input into two parts, right? So I'll first quickly look at what is the status quo, and then talk about what kind of collaborations are there and what is needed. So we all know the Paris Agreement target, right? But it is extremely important for us all to understand what it implies. And it implies that we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 90% from the 1990 levels by 2050. And when we think about that, it's true that it cannot be achieved without thinking about decarbonizing the global industrial sector, primarily because they contribute to almost 28% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And I've heard from the other fellow panelists about the cement, steel, ammonia. And so to be very, when we look at the global industrial sector, almost 45% of the greenhouse gas emissions from the industrial sector comes from the manufacturing of cement, steel, ammonia, and ethylene. And this is primarily because they also, and these are also known as hard to abate sectors. This is primarily because of the feedstock fuel and the high temperature heat requirements in these sectors, which is not so for many other sectors. One very important aspect which Dr. Mehte also mentioned was the economic consideration as a challenge. And I would also like to say this, that in just talking about decarbonizing the industry is not enough, but also looking at increasing the demand for low carbon sustainable products, primarily because companies who are internalizing these externalities are at present, I would say, for the lack of a better statement, are at a disadvantage, economic disadvantage, primarily because the products that emanate from such initiatives are have higher costs, and there are very little or no demand for such products. So we'll have to work on both these sides. So that's one. One important aspect that I also wanted to raise here is whenever we talk about decarbonizing the industry, we primarily look, and believe me, I have been to such sessions where I always find the private sector coming up and speaking. I think we also need to bring up the issue of the public sector enterprises or the state owned enterprises or entities, as is called in other parts of the world. They are also extremely important, primarily because because if you look at some of the reports of the past, like Thomson Reuters report in 2017, some of the top 100 global companies, you see some of our Indian public sector enterprises in that list, primarily from the perspective of greenhouse gas emissions. You know, like so there are companies like National Thermal Power Corporation Limited, then there is Coal India Limited, as well as ONGC, which is Oil and Natural Gas Corporation Limited. So also considering the fact that these public sector enterprises are important from the economic development perspective, they have also in the past and continue to do so. They've created several jobs and are also at the forefront of some R&D work. So if you see, the public sector enterprises are also the early test beds of some technology innovations that has happened so far. And the reasons for this can be several, but one of the reasons that has been cited in several cases is that the demonstration costs of these pilots are very high, and it can only be best absorbed by government-run firms, which I don't believe entirely. So the point is that if these public sector enterprises are technology, have been the early test beds of technology, why is it that we always leave them out when we talk about industrial decarbonization? So I'll speak from that perspective also, because GIZ, as a result of its ongoing initiative, which is funded by the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, is working with these public sector enterprises together with SCOPE, which is Standing Conference of Public Sector Public Enterprises, on enhancing capacities of these entities towards climate change and developing climate change mitigation strategies for the top 20 PSCs. So when we look at these PSCs, we've realized that NALCO, which is National Aluminium Company, and ONGC, they have realized the importance of low carbon products and are working towards it. However, the other collaborations that have happened, for example, NTPC came together with BHEL, which is Bharat Heavy Electricals Limited, and they came up, they are working towards an advanced ultra supercritical technology, which they have been talking about at various forums, will help them reduce their emissions substantially. Now, when I said that public sector enterprises are early test beds of technology innovation, I meant this primarily because if you see, ONGC is planning a plant which is going to capture CO2 in its Koyala refinery and Koyali refinery in Gujarat, and will, you know, feed it into an empty or dried up oil, onshore oil well, through a process called enhanced oil recovery. And now such experiments are extremely important, not just because for technology acceptance and penetration, but also to build confidence into the technology which is out there, is being tested. Now, we heard a lot about steel sector from Dr. Mathur, and of course, they've come up with this report which talks about 2030, 2040, and 2050 scenario. What is important is to see that the demand for steel, though increases in the business as usual scenario from in 2050 by 5 times, the energy demand increases by 4 times. So there is an incremental improvement, but this incremental improvement is not going to serve the purpose. So we will eventually have to look at carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which the report says will reduce emissions by 80%, or even green hydrogen, which will reduce the emissions by 94% in due course of time. Now, when we talk about collaboration, I think it is important that India as a country also needs to support its domestic industry in a world of uneven carbon prices and climate policy efforts. And one such collaboration could lead to standardization of carbon pricing approaches for the industry sector, which could be a very welcome step. I think Dr. K.N. Rao also was talking about carbon markets, but I'll come to that a little later. And one more, there needs to be collaboration also towards building capacities. What we've learned so far is, the public sector enterprises, they've heard about carbon pricing, but many of them don't know how they could be implemented. So there are organizations like CDP, WRI, and GIZ working on it, but we need to do this more aggressively. One aspect is that putting a price on carbon can also have consequences for the industry, primarily those who are exporting their products, and would need additional measures to safeguard their interests. And Dr. Mathur very briefly mentioned about border carbon adjustments. Now, for a country like India, they need to actively participate in such conversations globally around border carbon adjustments, primarily because this means that once the product is exported, it will be, they will apply the same carbon tax as would have been applied to a domestic producer, which means they are trying to level the playing field. Now, which means that once the product reaches the boundary of a country, they would apply the same carbon tax as was produced, as was by the domestic producer. So, how is it that India can actually participate in such conversations, and can they threshold against the risk of imposition of climate-related trade measures? So that's important. Now, we've heard several times from the fellow panelists about collaboration. So of course we heard that it requires collaboration across governments, civil society, research institutes. I'm saying this is specifically needed, keeping in mind the fact that the same thing led to cost reduction and scaling up of renewable energy generation. So why can't this happen for other such technologies, which will drive targeted innovation and also drive costs down? One key would be this, the collaboration both internally as well as externally, which will foster not just collaboration, but technology, innovation, and diffusion. And this is extremely important for India, primarily because they do not have cost-effective reserves of natural gas or coking coal, and hence working towards renewable energy generation and green hydrogen economy is in the interest of the country. So, and everyone keeps saying that there is less investments in research and development, but I think there is less efforts also made towards demonstration. So we have to move from R&D to R&DD. So it also there needs to be a lot of demonstration that should be there. Also, I think India needs to also work with other entities and seek support in terms of technology and finance from the donors. For example, I'll give you an example. The German government very recently came up with the national hydrogen strategy in June 2020 with the objective of importing hydrogen to the country. However, they also want to export the German technology and know-how. Now, looking at the climate-related impacts, the BMZ, which is the German Federal Ministry for Economic Development, and the BMU, which is the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, have said that they will also, through their bilateral cooperation projects, build in-country structures as well as capacities. So a country like India needs to know that such avenues exist, make the best use of such avenues. I already know that China has already received some funding from the German government for for some work on green hydrogen, and I think we at least need to get ready by putting in the structures and enhance building capacities around it for green hydrogen. Another important partnership is the fact that India-US strategic energy partnership, which can also increase modification and testing of the CCS technologies and help both the countries in meeting their targets. And there are some similar such collaborations internally within the country. For example, Tata Steel collaborating with Council for Scientific and Industrial Research on their carbon capture and storage, and they're trying to customize it to the requirements of other units which could then use that technology. So I think there is a lot done in terms of carbon markets. One last point, Pujarini, if you let me complete. When we say domestic carbon markets, I would want to inform the August gathering here that when I'm talking about domestic carbon markets, it will be trading between domestic players and not so much that somebody from the outside is going to pay for the carbon emission reductions. This is primarily because from 1st January 2020, NDC's Paris Agreement will come into effect. And we have NDC targets, which is an economy-wide target. And how will the government allow carbon credits to be sold outside to somebody outside the boundary of the country is not known as yet. So we'll have to wait and watch and see how it pans out in due course of time. I could speak a lot more on that. Yeah, I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kundan. And yes, I'm sure you could, host an entire session on carbon markets, and maybe we'll organize one of those as well. But thank you so much for your continuing pertinent points. Of course, very interested to see what, what happens at the end of this project with public sector enterprises that GIZ is leading. It's incredibly interesting. Well-made points there on the opportunities, both internationally, the bilateral dialogues, relationships that India needs to capitalize on, and Indian domestic carbon markets. So last but certainly not the least, and sorry, Peter, to have kept you waiting for so long, but so to introduce Peter first, Mr. Peter Levi joined the Energy and Technology Policy Division of IEA, International Energy Agency, in 2017. He leads the sectoral analysis of industry within the division. His work is focused on the technologies and policies that can be employed to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from hard-to-abate sectors within industry, as well as cross-cutting themes such as energy security, hydrogen, carbon capture, and electrification. Before joining EIA, Peter worked in the private sector for 3 years in an engineering consultancy. He attended the University of Cambridge, where he obtained a PhD and MPhil degrees, and prior to that, the University of Bristol for a master's in engineering degree. So Peter, we know that the IEA has just released a report, and we want to understand from you if you could share some insights from India from this report on iron and steel technology roadmaps. What are some of the key emerging trends that are coming out for industry decarbonization in India? And in the report, specifically in the opportunities section, there's a mention of cooperating with other countries that can be useful for sharing best practices and technology learnings. Kundan also pointed that out when he was speaking. What do you think is needed to accelerate this kind of cooperation?
Thank you very much, Jerini. So the ETP analysis, ETP 2020 analysis, which I'll share with you some excerpts of today. Are you hearing me okay? Yeah, I'm assuming so.
Yes.
the ETP 2020 analysis is actually a global analysis. We don't provide much regional detail in the analysis, but many of the messages for the heavy industry sector transition, of which we provide a deep dive look at in the publication, are particularly relevant to the Indian context, given all of the context that's been laid out today in terms of growing production volumes for many heavy industry outputs, and key technology challenges for new capacity additions in particular in that context. So just going back to the wider energy system context initially, as has been said, we've seen a proliferation of government and corporate targets pledging net zero emissions by various years in the future recently, whether it's 2050, whether it's 2060. And we've also seen huge progress in certain areas of the energy system, such as solar PV on the supply side and things like electric passenger vehicles on the demand side. And while these two factors bode well, progress, strong commitment from key actors on the one hand, and technology progress on the other hand, these positive signs alone will not be enough to get us in our assessment to where we want to be, which is net zero emissions for the energy system as a whole. And this, of course, is because the sources of emissions from the energy system are more numerous and diverse than just fossil fuel power plants and internal combustion engine passenger vehicles. Two key areas stand out, of course, when it comes to mitigating emissions. Those are long distance transport modes and heavy industries, comprising the whole so-called hard to abate sectors. And we today, obviously, I'll focus on remarks related to the heavy industries. So when we talk about heavy industries, we're really talking about the production of three key groups of materials: steel, cement, and primary chemicals in particular, but the chemical sector more broadly. Heavy industries use large volumes of fossil fuels for three key purposes: to generate high temperature heat, for use as feedstock or raw materials, and for use as reduction agents in the iron and steel sector in particular. And this obviously has important implications for the emissions from these sectors. Together, those three sectors account for just under a fifth of energy system emissions. Cement and steel account for 7% each, so that's around 15% of emissions globally from producing just two materials. Aside from the difficulties on the policy front, which I'll return to in a minute, there are two technical factors that underpin the hard to abate designation for these sectors: the scarcity of mature alternative production technologies that lead to deep reductions in emissions intensity, and then the large stock of emissions intensive assets that are already installed in various regions, which tend to be long-lived and costly to construct. Without any alteration to the current mode of operation of these existing assets, in heavy industry sectors, we estimate that these assets would lead to around 150 gigatons of CO2 emissions cumulatively by the end of their useful lifetime. Relative to a typical lifetime of around 40 years for steel and cement plants, 30 years for chemical plants, we estimate that the most emissions intensive units in these sectors are currently around 10 to 15 years old on average globally, so only around 1/3 of the way through their lifetimes. Existing assets, though, are only part of the story. The production of chemicals, steel, cement is expected to undergo robust growth in India in particular, one of the fastest growing large regions in our projections for all of these materials, in the coming decades to support an increasingly numerous and prosperous global population. The COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic fallout from that have led to depressed demands for the heavy industry material outputs, as the ripple effects of delayed construction projects and vehicle purchases make their way upstream to these where these heavy industry sectors are feeding these subsectors. However, these decreases in demand that we've seen and will see by year end this year have come at a huge cost to society, and we're likely to see big rebounds in demand once we get economies coming back on track. The only sustainable way to reduce emissions through reductions in material demand is to employ material efficiency strategies, including lightweighting, life extension, yield loss reduction, particularly relevant to the steel industry, reuse and recycling, to name a few key examples. Material efficiency is one among several measures that we see playing an important role in heavy industry emissions specifically. We have scenarios laying out all of the technology transitions in great detail in our ETP 2020 publication. In the short to medium term, we think that technology performance improvements, as improvements in energy efficiency or reductions in energy intensity of production, in conventional process equipment, together with material efficiency gains, these will be particularly important in the short to medium term. We estimate that these two measures alone will contribute nearly half the emission savings through to 2040 in our mitigation scenario for the energy system. Included within the technology performance mitigation category, improvements in energy intensity would be the impacts of India's landmark Perform Achieve trade scheme, which has been described in the context of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency discussions at the beginning, and it's an example of the kind of gold standard of policies in this area. In the longer term, though, the role of material efficiency continues to grow in absolute terms, but many of the gains that we need in emissions reductions in the long term stem from the deployment of innovative technologies. We're mainly talking about technologies in the carbon capture and electrolytic hydrogen families of technologies. These are really, of course, multiple technologies, all of which we describe in great detail in our clean technology guide, which is provided alongside the energy technology perspectives analysis. In the long run, we estimate that these two technology groups, CCUS and hydrogen, electrolytic hydrogen, will contribute around half the emissions reductions in the heavy industry sectors specifically. So that gives some idea of the challenges on the technology side, and I just wanted to also briefly mention some of the challenges faced on the policy side. There are two key features of heavy industries that make them challenging sectors to tackle for policymakers. Firstly, materials produced by heavy industry sectors, steel, cement, ethylene, propylene, ammonia, methanol. These are commodities that are widely traded, and this means that margins generally are slim because they're in global competitive markets, and first movers looking to reduce emissions can be undercut by regions or actors that are not facing the same kind of regulatory pressure. Secondly, technologies needed for deep emissions reductions are generally at earlier stages of technology readiness, and they are also come at a significant cost penalty relative to the incumbent technologies. And so while we tend not to make kind of India-specific or region-specific policy recommendations in the context of our ETP 2020 analysis, because of the bespoke requirements of the various regional contexts, we have identified 4 key action areas for governments and other important stakeholders, producers, academia, and research institutions. So I'll just close with summarizing these 4. So firstly, there's the need to manage existing assets. This includes that the capacity additions that will be required in the short term. Dr. Mathur talked about the fact that the trajectory of rising steel production in India is a case study where lots more capacity is needed during a time where innovative technologies for providing it are not available. So this is an important feature of the future development of heavy industry sectors that needs to be specifically targeted and taken into account. So capacity additions in the short term should be retrofit ready where possible, and financial incentives should be put in place to incentivize energy efficiency improvements, much like the Perform Achieve trade scheme in India today. Secondly, there's a variety of ways that differentiated markets can be set up to establish a level playing field while supporting more expensive and less emissions intensive process equipment. Examples of this include public and private procurement strategies, carbon contracts for difference, and several other measures, some of which have been talked about today. I thought I'd mention those that hadn't been mentioned yet. So thirdly, there's the need for financial support for early stage technologies, both directly for specific demonstration and pilot projects, but also indirectly through ensuring coordinated efforts on innovation and the readiness of supporting infrastructure. So all of the electrolysis equipment, transmission, distribution, renewable power supply, these kind of infrastructure implications. And then lastly, material efficiency measures is a specific category of cluster of mitigation measures can be supported and accelerated with improved coordination between actors across the value chain, through from design through to end use and disposal and end of life phase of the material uses, and coordinating these waste collection and sorting efforts is an important kind of actor problem where governments can play a role in enhancing the coordination there. So I'll leave it there and look forward to taking any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. And a quick thank you to all our panelists. And we're running a little bit behind schedule, but I hope we'll still be able to take some questions. I'd like to go now to one of Climate Group's very close partners in the We Mean Business Coalition. We have Joe Phelan here, the director of WBCSD in India. Over to you, Joe, for quick remarks on what we've heard here today and any other reflections that you might have on decarbonizing heavy industry.
Thank you. Okay, so thanks very much, Pujari, and also Divya, and a really interesting conversation, which I took a lot of notes on, but I won't summarize because of time. I would just like to acknowledge another partner that's very important in this area is the CDP, and Daman was going to be on this call, but he's unwell at the moment, so he can't join. So our best wishes are with him and his family, obviously, and we look forward to him recovering fully. Let me just say a couple of things. So it was very powerful when Mr. Prabhu talked about the scale of the challenges, but that not acting harms individual companies and harms the country. Not acting on climate is harmful, and that there are a lot of benefits in acting and taking action. And then Dr. Mathur reminding us also that we're in the middle of this energy transition, and that very soon renewable electricity and storage will provide us power 24 hours a day at par or below the cost of coal. And we didn't think that that would be the case by 2022, just a few years ago. And so this change is happening very fast, and there are significant challenges ahead. And we know that they're biggest in heavy industry and the hard to abate sectors. But nevertheless, we can see where those pain points are, and we understand that with effort, progress will be made there too. It was, as always, very interesting to hear about the work of the cement sector, who have done more work in India than anywhere else to set a pathway and implement action to low carbon operations, and are now looking very hard at going from a low carbon future to a zero carbon future, where there are big challenges, but I think what they've shown is that collaboration and a long-term vision can have a very powerful results. And so they've got more than 10 years track record, first working with WBCSD on the Cement Sustainability Initiative, now through the Global Concrete and Cement Association, a long track record of implementing climate measures in the context of long-term vision. A big focus from Dr. Mathur and also from Atul Prakash on the importance of investing in electrolyzers, and India becoming world-class as a key technology to enable further decarbonisation and competitiveness for Indian industry going forwards, which is very important. I want to highlight a couple of things on behalf of CDP. Carbon pricing came up as an important solution, carbon pricing, carbon adjustments, this, as a way to unlock investments and also to create a level playing field, which is of critical importance in globally traded goods. There are 10 companies from the heavy industry sector disclosing to CDP that they're using an internal carbon price. And there are 23 companies in India who, working with CDP and the Science Based Targets Initiative, have set science-based targets for their own business. And WBCSD, my organization, is working in depth with companies in the paper sector and the chemical sector on their strategies to implement their net zero approach. We now have as a membership criteria of our organization, we are a 200 member organization, and one of the criteria now is to be net zero by 2050. We think we're the only business association to do that, and we're working in depth in India with companies in the paper sector and the chemical sector, supporting them directly on how to implement that. The keys are continuous effort now, individually, collective action, sectorally, and across value chains. Carbon pricing is very important. The opportunity around finance, I think, is particularly important in the next year. And we have Hemant here from CEW, and some of you, or many of you, will have seen the article over the weekend from Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, which highlighted the opportunity that COP26 presents to scale up what's available in terms of climate finance and how climate finance works. And so, look, let me just end by saying that I've said collaboration a few times. The next 12 months are really important for India. I think that compared to 5 years ago, industry and government in India are much more aligned. There was quite a strong story already from industry 5 years ago. I think now the government has a very strong story alongside that of industry, and there's a strong alignment. And so my organization, WBCSD, CDP, the Climate Group, organizations like TERI and CEW, IEA, and Lead It with the WEF, are all committed to, positive market-based approaches to greatly accelerating decarbonisation, supporting strong policy measures. And so I think there is a big opportunity for India over the next 12 months. And, as partners operating in this space, we look forward to India taking advantage of those opportunities. We can't miss this with it being in the UK. This is a really big opportunity for India to shape the environment for the next 10 years, which are crucial. So let me finish there and thank the Climate Group for bringing together such an excellent group of speakers.
Thank you so much, Joe. And unfortunately, we are already running a few minutes over time, so we will not have time for questions, though we did have some interesting questions around jobs and MSMEs. So what we will try to do is send those questions to our panelists and try and get the answers to those who have asked the questions. I want to take this time again to thank Dr. Mate, Hemant, Peter, Kundan, Joe, and Mr. Prakash for being here, for being such a fabulous panel, and of course to Dr. Mathur and Mr. Prabhu for setting us off on a high note. Thank you so much, and we hope to keep engaging with all of you. I mean, these conversations are just the beginning, and we have a long way to go, and I hope we'll all be able to collaborate on this journey towards decarbonizing heavy industries and a under 2 degree and hopefully under 1.5 degree world. So thank you so much, and happy holidays, and see you in the New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.